Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to today cover the latest developments as well as give you a general overview on the job retention scheme. To give it its full title, the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. As you all know, the coronavirus crisis has had quite a drastic impact on businesses across many sectors, causing closures, lost custom, lost revenue, cash flow problems. The scheme that we're talking about today has been introduced to encourage employers to retain their workforce throughout this difficult time and to try and avert mass redundancies. So under this scheme, the government pays 80% of the wage costs of employees who are placed on temporary leave by their employer. This type of leave is to be known as furlough. Now, we've never had any sort of legal definition of furlough in UK employment law history. It's a new concept. It is a concept that's been borrowed from US labour law, and while there's no specific legal definition, we have come to understand from the guidance that's been produced by HMRC that temporary furlough basically means temporary leave of absence for staff who continue to be employed, and they also have employment rights continuing even while off on furlough leave. So furloughed staff will continue, for example, to accrue holiday entitlement, and that's one of the things that we'll be talking about later on in the webinar. So as I say, one of the key objectives of the scheme that was announced by the Chancellor on the 20th of March is to avoid job losses. Now, the scheme itself, the guidance that's been produced has gone through, I think, 9 different iterations now. So there's been quite a lot of amendments in a fairly short period of time. But the main headline, of course, as most people I'm sure by now already know, that the main effect of this scheme is that it allows staff to be furloughed, and the government will cover up to 80% of the employee's wage, which is capped at £2,500 per employee per month. And again, during the webinar, we'll go into a bit more detail about what that covers, what that includes, and what it doesn't include. So just to give you a wee bit of, I suppose, legal background, the scheme is governed by a Treasury direction that was published on the 15th of April. It sets out the legal framework for the guidance. There have been some areas where the guidance hasn't actually matched the direction from the Treasury. And one example of that is in relation to holiday leave entitlement. There's been some inconsistency there, and there's been a few inconsistencies elsewhere. It's important to note that the HMRC guidance is actually not legally binding, but it's very important for employers to read it and to understand it, and to understand how the scheme actually works in practice. So which employers can apply for funding under the scheme? Well, really, the scheme is open to any UK employer, regardless of their size or sector. To qualify, an employer must have 2 things. First, it has to have created and started a PAYE payroll scheme on or before the 19th of March this year. And second, it must have a UK bank account. Obviously, very important to have a UK bank account because that's how the reimbursement of the wage costs are paid by HMRC into businesses' bank accounts. That's how you get the money. And generally speaking, it's been working quite expediently once applications have been submitted. So just a few stats there at the bottom of that slide. We now know that the scheme will run to the 31st of October this year. That's an announcement that was made by the Chancellor earlier on this week. And the applications that can be made for reimbursement can be backdated to the 1st of March. So effectively, you've got 8 months of a lifespan for the job retention scheme. And as of a few days ago, we already have over 7.5 million jobs that have been furloughed, with over 535,000 employers taking part in the scheme. So employees you can claim for, it's very wide. The scope of this is quite wide. It covers all sorts of employees, full-time, part-time, foreign nationals, employees engaged on flexible or zero-hour contracts, fixed-term contracts. But it is important to note that not all members of the workforce are covered by the scheme, and the 4 criteria that must be met in order for a claim to be made are as follows. First, the employee must have been on the payroll on or before the 19th of March 2020. That's changed from the original cutoff date, which was previously the 28th of February. A real-time information, otherwise known as RTI, submission notifying payment in respect of the employee must have been made to HMRC on or before the 19th of March. Third, the employee must not undertake any work for the employer or indeed any linked or associated organisation once they are furloughed. If the employee is to carry out any work, even on reduced hours, then they'll not be eligible for reimbursement under the scheme. Then the fourth category, then the employee must have one of the eligible statuses, which is mentioned in the HMRC guidance. Now, this guidance covers a range of different rules. So, for example, employees engaged under any type of employment contract, that's, as I say, full-time, part-time, permanent, fixed-term, flexible, 0 hours, and so on. Apprentices are also covered, and they may continue to undertake training while furloughed. Category B workers, office holders, including company directors, and also the likes of salaried members of LLPs and agency workers as well. So employees who have more than one employer can actually be furloughed by one employer and continue to work for another employer. Each job is treated separately, and the cap applies to each separately as well. So foreign nationals and employees on all categories of visa are also eligible to be furloughed. So one of the queries that we have been receiving quite a lot is in relation to whether absent and former members of the workforce are able to be furloughed. Only some absent and former members of the workforce are eligible for funding under the scheme, and the following groups are able to be furloughed under the scheme. For example, those absent from work on unpaid leave, which started after the 28th of February. Also, those absent from work because they have caring responsibilities resulting from coronavirus, for example, looking after children or caring for a vulnerable person. Third, then, those absent from work because they are shielding in line with public health guidance or need to stay at home with someone who is shielding. So in relation to a couple of groups that are not able to be furloughed under the scheme, I should add that those absent on unpaid leave, which started on or prior to the 20th of February, will not be covered by the scheme. They may be covered once they have returned to work. However, an employer cannot agree to bring the original return date forward in order to allow them access to the scheme. There are some situations where people who have left employments prior to the 19th of March that normally would not fall under the scheme can actually fall under the scheme in certain situations. There's two specific situations. If they were on the PAYE payroll on the 19th of March, and that was notified to HMRC by way of an RTI submission on or before that date, and those who stop work and are then rehired, say that if an employee has already been furloughed by their current employer, then they will otherwise not be eligible to be furloughed by a former employer. So I've had a few situations like this myself where people who have left a job to start another job, and just at the outbreak of the pandemic and the restrictions that came into place and the introduction of the job retention scheme, they have been in some cases able to go back to a former employer and asked to be rehired and placed on the furlough scheme. And thankfully that has happened in a few cases, although not all cases. Certain employers have regarded themselves as not being able to furlough staff, particularly some in the public sector, although we are starting to see more public sector bodies, including councils, engaging in using the furlough scheme. I think this morning it was announced that Queen's University are furloughing around 200 workers as well. There's been, I suppose, various news items this week about different councils locally who have been furloughing several hundred staff as well. So are sick and self-isolating employees able to be furloughed? That's another question that we've been getting quite a lot. The position for sick and self-isolating employees is complex. Unhelpfully, the employee-facing version of the HMRC guidance really oversimplifies the issue when it says that such employees can be furloughed at any time. Employers need to make sure that sick and self-isolating and also shielding employees understand that there are in fact significant constraints on their ability to furlough them. Again, I've had the query quite a lot over the last 6 weeks or so. My employee who is shielding says they have a statutory entitlement to be furloughed. They don't. So it's the option, the discretion is there for the employer to exercise that option, but it may not be able to do so in certain situations. The direction stipulates that where statutory sick pay is payable or liable to be payable to an employee, regardless of whether it is ever claimed at the time that the employer wishes to furlough, then the furlough cannot actually begin until the original SSP period has ended. So, for example, if an employee contracts coronavirus and is then signed off sick for 2 weeks, the employee then becomes entitled to be paid SSP. The employer will only be able to furlough this employee once that 2-week sick period is over. Once it is over, the employer is potentially able to furlough the employee regardless of whether they subsequently then fall ill or need to self-isolate. So on the face of it, this rule appears to restrict the ability of employers to furlough shielding employees, but shielding employees are entitled to SSP. So if an employee is advised to shield for 12 weeks, they will be entitled to SSP for that initial 12-week period. And under the wording of the direction, this initial SSP period would have to lapse before the furlough period could begin. So I think this must be an unintended consequence of the direction, since it's directly contrary to the guidance. Also, the question of whether an employer is entitled to furlough a sick employee depends on the length of the sickness absence and the reason for wanting to furlough them. The guidance produced by government differentiates between short-term and long-term sickness absence. Short-term sickness absence is usually defined and understood to mean absences that last up to 4 weeks. So an employee who is absent due to short-term sickness or because they're self-isolating should not be furloughed simply because of that absence. Instead, they should be treated as absent on sick leave and be paid SSP. However, an employee who is absent due to short-term sickness or because they're self-isolating can be furloughed for business reasons. Again, I'm quoting from the guidance, for business reasons. Once the original SSP period has ended, however, that's important. So they can only be placed in furlough once the SSP period has ended. If employees furlough, then they should cease to pay the sick pay and reclassify the employee as a furloughed employee and pay furlough pay. Where the employee is entitled to full contractual sick pay, they may well be reluctant to agree to be furloughed if this would result in a shortfall in their pay. So that's one of the trickier areas for employers to face. I think the majority of employees would only pay SSP, but for those that pay enhanced contractual sick pay, it may be more difficult for them to convince an employee who is in receipt of that contractual sick pay to agree to be furloughed. So in relation to long-term sickness, an employee who is absent due to long-term sickness, they can be furloughed. The guidance simply says it's up to the employer to decide whether to furlough these employees. There appears to be no requirement that a decision be motivated by business reasons. If the employer decides to furlough, then they should cease to pay sick pay and reclassify the employee as a furloughed employee and pay furlough pay. So what happens if a furloughed employee becomes sick while furloughed? Well, the guidance says that it's up to the employers to decide whether to keep such an employee on furlough or regard them as absent on sick leave. Usually it will make sense to keep such an employee on furlough, but if the employee is entitled to full contractual sick pay, then again, they may prefer to be treated as sick rather than receive the reduced furlough rate of pay. So I should also make the point that it's feasible, obviously, for people who are on furlough to carry out voluntary work or to carry out training. And I'll come on to that again shortly. So what happens then to employees who are absent on some form of paid family leave, such as maternity leave or parental leave? Well, employees taking or indeed planning to take a form of paid family leave during the proposed furlough period are entitled to take their leave in the normal way. And this covers maternity, paternity, adoption, shared parental leave, and parental bereavement leave. Employees are also entitled to be paid their statutory payments, such as statutory maternity pay, in the normal way. However, if the employee was furloughed and then started their family leave on after the 25th of April, the employer may need to calculate the employee's average weekly earnings differently. In essence, the calculation must be based on the pay that the employee would have received had they not been furloughed. If the employer offers enhanced pay, then this will count as wage costs for the purposes of the scheme and can be reclaimed, subject, of course, to the upper limit of £2,500 per month. So, as we've seen, basically, those people on various statutory types of leave will have the same rules that normally apply to them during the job retention scheme, by and large. So, moving on to the next section, as I said, the aim of the scheme is to save jobs. The first version of the HMRC guidance did not stipulate any requirement that an employer must only be able to use the scheme if they would otherwise have made people redundant, and that being the main sort of criteria initially. The guidance has evolved. The scheme was designed to support employers whose operations have been severely affected by coronavirus. It appeared that the scheme was in fact open to employers facing difficulties but who had not yet considered making staff redundant. So in my view, the more recent versions of the guidance, the revised guidance, make it even clearer that the scheme is available to all employers, regardless of whether they're considering redundancies or not. The latest guidance says that the scheme is designed to help employers whose operations have been severely affected by coronavirus in order to retain their staff. So very important to note that it's not necessary for staff to be furloughed for the 3-week periods on a consistent basis. It is possible for employers to rotate staff on furlough. So the claims that are made and the furlough breaks must be for a minimum of 3 consecutive weeks. Employees can be furloughed for, say, a period of 3 weeks or 6 weeks, and then brought back into the workplace and then re-furloughed. It's completely feasible under the scheme to do that. There's no rule or requirement to furlough all of the employees at the same time. So there are many cases where perhaps an employer has decided to furlough a percentage of the workforce, maybe 50% of the workforce or 90% of the workforce, in order to retain some staff to carry out the essential functions of the business. But it is important to, again, repeat that those people who have been furloughed cannot perform any work for the employer while furloughed. They can do voluntary work and they can do training. The training may need to be paid full pay, depending obviously on how much training is being done and so forth. The scheme costs will cover that in most cases. Furloughed staff can work for unrelated businesses, so it is feasible for people to be furloughed and go off and work for the likes of Tesco's or Sainsbury's or some other employer. So, what can be claimed under the scheme? If eligible, then employers can apply for a grant from HMRC to cover the wage costs of furloughed employees. Wage costs is defined in the guidance as covering the following: the lower of 80% of the employee's gross monthly pay in the last pay period prior to the 19th of March 2020, that's known as the reference salary, or £2,500 per month. Secondly, the associated employer national insurance contributions. And third, if the employee has a pension, the minimum automatic enrollment employer pension contributions, and that's currently 3% of income above the lower limit of the qualifying earnings. And that's, again, on the subsidised wage only, so it's reduced. The pension scheme does not have to be an auto-enrollment pension scheme, by the way. So for these purposes, the reference salary includes only regular payments, which the employer is legally obliged to pay to the employee. In this context, regular excludes any payments which are conditional and or variable according to, for example, the performance of the business or the employee, any contribution made by the employee to the performance of the business and or the discretion of the employer, unless the variable payment arises from a legally binding contract. So therefore, the reference salary will include basic pay and any other non-discretionary payments such as overtime, fees, and contractual commission payments. However, many types of pay are actually excluded from the scheme, as are non-cash payments as well. So to be specific, what's excluded from the job retention scheme? So clearly, yes, discretionary bonuses and commission are excluded, non-cash payments, salary sacrifice schemes, and apprenticeship levy and student loans are all excluded. So things like tips, discretionary bonus payments, discretionary commission payments, anything that's not clearly contractual. The cost of a non-cash benefit, such as, that would include the taxable benefits in kind, for example, a car, health insurance, the cost of benefits provided through salary sacrifice schemes, including pension contributions as well, and also employer pension contributions relating to the 80% of salary, or the £2,500 of floor, which are over and above the minimum automatic enrolment employer pension contributions. If an employer wishes to continue providing excluded payments or benefits, then it must bear the cost of doing so itself. It is not permitted to set off any part of the grant made under the scheme toward the cost of providing any such payments or benefits. If the employer wishes to suspend those payments or benefits, then it obviously must obtain the employee's agreement to do so. And we're going to come on shortly in relation to what employers must do to get agreement from employees, to get their consent to not only place them on furlough, but to reduce their pay and remove benefits and so forth. It's also very important to note that employers must pay staff the full amount of the grant that they have claimed, and once they get paid by HMRC, that has to be paid to the employee. The employer cannot make any reduction in relation to that. It can't withhold pay for any reason. It must pay the full amount back that's been claimed to the particular employee. Employers must continue to make apprenticeship levy and student loan payments. Grants under the scheme do not cover these payments. So what happens where employees have variable pay? Well, where pay varies, employers should take a number of different approaches. And actually, just before I come on to that section, I just want to mention a few things on the slide that you see at the moment. A few sort of practical tips. So what can be claimed on the scheme directly then? Well, it's important to note obviously that the portal that has been created by HMRC in a fairly short period of time is now open 24/7. It's been open now for several weeks. As I said earlier, the claims can be backdated to the 1st of March. The payments are currently being processed in around 6 days by HMRC, which generally means employers are getting payments into their bank account on the 7th day after making the application. Very useful calculator has been put onto the website by HMRC, and I would strongly advise all employers considering using the furlough scheme to make their calculations first using that online calculator in order to ensure they've got all the relevant information that they need before submitting the claim, because it'll help to identify any errors and to make sure that you've got all the relevant information that you need. It's obviously important to get it right first time or the application will be rejected. One of the things that the Revenue have done in the last few days, they've, I suppose, taken on board some feedback, because when the portal was first live, it was impossible for employers making an application to save and return the form, the online form, before lodging the claim. They had to do it all in one go, which is another reason why it was particularly important for the calculator to be used beforehand. But now in the last few days, HMRC have actually introduced a function whereby you can save the details you've entered. If you've only partially completed the online application, you can save that and then return to it at a later date in order to complete it. So quite useful if you need to go and check some further information. Obviously, the timing of each of the claims being made by employers is important. It has to be done, just before or during the payroll run. For employers that have and quite a lot of them obviously are experiencing cash flow problems, it's worth considering getting the benefit of a coronavirus business interruption loan or the more recently announced bounce back loan, which may assist in identifying those cash flow problems. Generally speaking, if employers are having difficulty in paying staff their wages on the agreed dates and times, then obviously it's worthwhile getting consent from the employee, at least making them aware of the issues in relation to cash flow, and getting consent from the employee to confirm that they will obviously pay the individual wages whenever they get the funds in place, whether that's obviously the grant from HMRC job retention scheme or whether it's cash from one of those types of loan scheme that I've just mentioned there. So in terms of variable pay, where the pay varies, employers have to take the following approach. If the employee has been employed for a full 12 months prior to the claim, then they should use the higher of either the same month's earnings from the previous year or the average monthly earnings from 2019-2020 tax year. If the employee has been employed for only 12 months, then the employer should use an average of their monthly earnings since they started work until the date they are furloughed. And if the employee has been employed for less than a month, then the employer should use a pro rata basis, a pro rata assessment of their earnings so far. Once an employer has worked out the amount of salary to be claimed, it will also need to work out the amount of employer national insurance contributions and the minimum automatic enrollment employer pension contributions that can be claimed. So what is a reference salary for an employee who has just returned or will return from statutory leave or unpaid leave? Where an employer wishes to furlough an employee who has returned to work from statutory leave, the correct reference salary is their normal gross salary, not the pay they received while on statutory leave. So in this context, statutory leave would cover sick leave, maternity leave, paternity and adoption leave as well, also shared parental leave and unpaid parental leave. If an employee returning from statutory leave has variable pay, then the reference salary should be calculated using either the same month's earnings from the previous year or the average monthly earnings from the 2019-2020 tax year. So what will the furloughed employee receive? Well, the maximum funding that can be recovered under the scheme, as we know, is £2,500 per month or 80% of pay if lower. The employer should deduct income tax and employee national insurance contributions and other deductions in the normal way, and then pay the whole of the net payment to the employee. As I said, no money should be deducted to cover the costs of continuing to provide benefits or for any other reason, for example, some sort of administration charge. What this means in practice is that a furloughed employee earning up to £37,500 per annum gross would then receive 80% of their actual pay. Anyone earning over £37,500 per annum will experience a shortfall over and above the 20% due to the application of the cap that is in place. So just to give you a kind of a worked example, an employee who earns £24,000 per annum gross, then their monthly salary is going to be £2,000 per annum gross. £2,000 times 0.8, that's 80%, is going to be £1,600 paid to the employer, plus additional sum for the employer national insurance contributions and the pension contributions if applicable. So the employer deducts income tax and employee NICs and any other deductions from the £1,600, so that's 80% of the £24,000. Then the employee will receive the net amount of approximately, in this case, this example, £1,428 compared to the usual net amount of roughly £1,655. So they're going to get under this scheme reimbursement of £1,428. They normally would get paid £1,655. So, do employers have to cover the shortfall in pay? Ordinarily, unless an employer has a contractual right to lay an employee off without pay, it must maintain normal pay for employees who are laid off temporarily. This would mean that the employer would be obliged to cover the shortfall in pay, namely the 20% not covered by the scheme, and any shortfall in the 80% suffered by those earning in excess of £37,500 per annum. The guidance produced by HMRC states that employers may choose to pay any shortfall, but they are not obliged to under the scheme. Although employers are not obliged to top up any shortfall under the rules governing the scheme, they will often be under a contractual obligation to top up to normal pay. However, before placing an employee on furlough, the guidance provides that an employer should discuss the scheme with their staff and make any changes to the employment contract by way of an agreement. In practice, an employer who does not wish to top up the shortfall should obtain the written agreement of employees to receive only the reduced pay under the scheme. And this agreement has to be documented in writing. HMRC have made it clear that an employer must be able to demonstrate that they've obtained agreement from the relevant employees who they've furloughed. Where an employee refuses to agree to this change, then an employer may decide not to furlough the employee and instead can make them redundant. So, very important to get consent. And if you need to discuss the situation with an employee who refuses to be furloughed, then obviously you may want to bring it to their attention that an alternative may well be redundancy. It is important to be wary, though, of potential unfair dismissal. In any situation involving redundancy, one of the key objectives of that redundancy process has to be a consultation which looks at ways of avoiding or mitigating against the risk of redundancy. And of course, the current unprecedented implementation of the job retention scheme is a way of mitigating against redundancy. So there is a bit of a, I suppose, a catch-22 here. But if the employee is refusing to avail or refusing to agree to be furloughed and allowing the employer to avail of the scheme, then redundancy may be the only option at that stage. So very important to obtain clear agreement from the employee, a written agreement via email. So quite often what we've been doing is advising employers to issue a letter or a letter by email expressing its wish to place the employee on furlough leave, to reduce the employee's pay to 80%, and also to confirm that no benefits in kind will be paid for that period of furlough leave, which is, of course, a temporary arrangement. And where an employee simply then emails back to say they confirm to those arrangements, they consent to those arrangements, that is confirmation, and you've got an agreement in place, and that will be enough for HMRC. They have said in the guidance that's important for employers to keep this agreement, to keep the documentation that confirms the agreements with employees who have been placed on furlough leave for 5 years. It's clear that HMRC will be auditing employers who have used the job retention scheme and will be doing so over the next few years. So how should employees be selected? How should employers go about selecting employees for furlough? If an employer needs to furlough all staff, then the decision-making process will be straightforward. However, if the employer needs to furlough only some staff, then it'll have to decide which staff to furlough and which staff will remain working. The guidance is not prescriptive about the process an employer should adopt when making these kinds of decisions, but it does state that equality and discrimination laws will apply in the usual way. Employers also need to be mindful of the duty of mutual trust and confidence. The safest course of action would be to apply objective selection criteria when selecting who to furlough from a pool of candidates. It's very similar to what an employer needs to do in a redundancy situation. So you have to have objective and fair criteria based on information that is readily accessible. You want to have clear information and your records perhaps concerning disciplinary records, timekeeping, absence rates, those sorts of things would be clear objective criteria. As long as you've got full information on those sorts of criteria, then that's the kind of thing that can be used. In the absence of any detailed records along those lines, an employer would have the option of using some sort of assessment whereby they could, either by way of a paper exercise or perhaps by interviews, select employees by way of a process similar to a recruitment or a promotion process, whereby you can address the employees with 4 or 5 questions and assess their answers. But that's going to be obviously quite time consuming. So it's always best to try and just use, the existing information and personnel records to apply objective selection criteria in order to avoid any potential claims of unlawful discrimination. And when you're speaking to the employees that you're wanting to place on furlough, very important to explain the reasoning behind your decisions, explain the benefits to them and to the company. Obviously, part of the rationale is to not only save jobs, but also to try and save the business as well, to try and ensure that there is a business for the employee to continue working for. And explain the alternatives. In the absence of using the job retention scheme, in most cases the alternative is unfortunately going to be a job loss. And we've already seen that in a number of organizations, some very large organizations over the last few months, who have gone into administration with the subsequent risk of significant job losses. So just to cover off the impact of job retention scheme on those on national minimum wage or national living wage. Obviously, the legislation that applies to ensuring workers have entitlement to be paid at national minimum wage levels, that applies to working hours. So in a sense, in reality, the furlough scheme is an exception to this requirement. People on furlough are not actually working. So it's okay for them to be paid effectively below the national minimum wage and national living wage minimums, the statutory minimums. So one, I suppose, exception to that is where employees who are training while on furlough, they must be paid at least the national minimum wage because they are training. But that's likely that the scheme funding will actually cover the payment for those training hours. In any event, but if not, then the employer may actually have to they may have to top up the payment made to ensure that the employees who are training are brought up to the national minimum wage levels. And the guidance makes it clear that apprentices must be paid at least the apprenticeship minimum wage or national minimum wage, whatever is applicable, to their apprenticeship contracts. So then the quite, I suppose, thorny issue of furlough and its consequences for annual leave. And this is one area where I think HMRC knew from a very, very early stage that they were going to have some difficulties in meeting the expectations of both employers and employees. They've said pretty much from the start that they are keeping the issue of holiday leave and entitlement under continuous review. And to be fair, they have proved very much true to their word on that one. Just on Wednesday of this week, they have issued further guidance, albeit this guidance impacts upon not just people who are currently off on furlough leave, but also people who are continuing to work. So it's been useful guidance this week, useful clarification, because it does confirm what a lot of people were thinking, such as myself, that it is feasible for employers to compel furloughed staff to take leave. One of the main concerns for employers was the fact that people who are off on furlough leave would have a considerable amount of leave accrued during their period of furlough, which means that by the end of the furlough period, they could have something like 20 odd days accrued and have been unable to use it. So the guidance has confirmed that leave can be taken while on furlough, and it should be encouraged in my view, because you don't want employees coming back with considerable amount of leave entitlement accrued that needs to be used up in a short period of time. We have, of course, both Northern Ireland Executive and GB government have passed amendments to the working time regulations, which allows the carryover of up to 4 weeks worth of leave into the next holiday year. So ordinarily, employers would have allowed, maybe by way of their contracts, perhaps up to 5 days of leave to be carried over from one leave year into the next. It's obviously at the discretion of the employer whether to increase that amount or not, but the government has basically confirmed, by way of recently introduced legislation, that it's amended the working time regulations, and employees can actually carry across up to 4 weeks worth of leave. Now, the ordinary requirement is for everyone to get 5.6 weeks leave. So because of the wording of the working time directive and the working time regulations that implement the working time directive, the core block of leave, which is essentially the 20 days, the 4 weeks, that's the portion that can be carried forward into the next holiday year. So employers really should be encouraging staff to use the remaining 1.6 weeks in this holiday year. So, they should at least use that, which is another good reason to explain to people on furlough leave that they should be aiming to use as a minimum 1.6 weeks of leave while on furlough. Obviously, everyone's holiday year is different. It may not follow the calendar year. It may not be from January to December. It could be, from April to March, for example. So there will be obviously differences in different workplaces in terms of when people will be able to use up their holiday leave before the end of the holiday year, and how much they can then carry over. But they will have the statutory right as of now to carry over up to 20 days unused holiday leave into the following holiday year. And one of the most important things that was issued this week on Wednesday in the new holiday leave guidance, where it did confirm that employers can compel furloughed staff to take leave. The guidance states that if an employer requires a worker to take holiday while on furlough, it's important for the employer to consider whether any restrictions exist which may prevent the worker from actually enjoying their holiday. So you'll see it on the slide there, where the worker is under restrictions such as the need to socially distance or self-isolate, and that could prevent the worker from resting, relaxing, and enjoying leisure time, which is obviously the fundamental purpose of holiday. Then the employer will not be able to compel the employee taking leave in those type of circumstances. The working time directive was originally brought in as a health and safety measure. It set in place various minimum limits for working hours and introducing rest breaks and so forth. So you can understand why the government has said that in the context of the coronavirus, where people are needing to socially distance and self-isolate, then it may not be feasible, legally feasible, to compel certain types of workers to take leave even when they're furloughed. So just they need to carry out a risk assessment, in my view, of the particular employee's personal circumstances to see whether they can compel them to take leave at certain points. So as we know, then leave will continue to accrue while staff are on furlough. And because the scheme is going to be 8 months long, for people who've been furloughed from the 1st of March and will be furloughed until the end of the scheme at the 31st of October, they could have roughly 20 odd days of leave accrued. So it is useful, it is important to have that guidance, and for employers to try and encourage employees to take leave as much as possible. So as I said, there's a right to carry up to 4 weeks leave, and encourage employees to use at the very least the 1.6 weeks of the added leave entitlement this year. Employers have to avoid using the reduced furlough pay figure whenever they're calculating leave pay. So there will be certain circumstances, particularly with bank holidays, where it may be necessary for an employer to effectively top up the furloughed workers' pay. So where furloughed employees usually work a bank holiday, then that can be included in the grant payment paid by HMRC. But if the employee usually takes bank holidays as leave, then the employer will either have to top up the pay to the usual holiday pay, the normal pay amount, or alternatively they could provide a day of holiday in lieu instead. So a couple of slides then to finish off in terms of a few of the more, I suppose, practical issues. Is it feasible for employers to deal with grievance or disciplinary processes during furlough? Well, it's not clear from the guidance or the Treasury direction, although they have recently confirmed in one of their updates a few weeks ago, a few days ago, in fact, I think it was only about a week ago, that they union representatives can still fulfill their statutory roles even if they have been furloughed. So, you know, a union rep could be brought along to a disciplinary hearing to act as a statutory companion for an employee who is furloughed or maybe not even furloughed. So they could also be involved in consultation discussions in terms of any collective consultation, whether that relates to changing contractual terms or redundancy consultation. They can be involved in grievance meetings. So in terms of specific case scenarios, it won't be possible, generally speaking, for HR staff or line management, for example, to get involved in these kind of internal disciplinary or grievance processes if they themselves have been furloughed. That would be regarded as providing work. I mean, obviously, particularly for HR staff, part of their role, part of their key role is to provide advice, assistance, and to manage and organise grievance processes or disciplinary processes. So quite clearly, they can't do that. They can't get involved in these situations where they are furloughed. Furloughed staff can be involved in grievances that they have raised. So that would not be seen as getting involved in work. So generally speaking, if a furloughed member of staff has a grievance they wish to raise, it can be dealt with. They should obviously have their grievance addressed. It may be possible for certain furloughed staff to be involved in disciplinary processes, but I would strongly advise you take legal advice first, because as the case is with HR staff and management, it very often will be a considerable difficulty for those kind of people to be involved in certain types of disciplinary processes. But it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So in certain circumstances, it could be possible for furloughed staff to get involved if that's not seen as their, part of their normal duties. It wouldn't be regarded as performing work for the company. So obviously, as we've heard earlier this week on Tuesday, I think it was, the government has announced that the scheme will run on to the 31st of October, and applications under the job retention scheme can be made up to then. There are no changes in the scheme until the 1st of August. We will find out at the end of this month what the government is planning to do, but we have been given the tip by the Chancellor that from August to October, the scheme will continue on the basis of furloughed employees being brought back on a part-time basis. He was very cryptic about that. We really don't know yet what that means. He did say, however, that employers will have to share the burden of wage costs. So there's been a lot of speculation around that and what it could mean. But we will find out hopefully at some stage next week or maybe a few days toward the end of the month. But the speculation at the moment is that the government may, for example, be planning to reduce the current 80% cover down to 60% perhaps, and certain sectors, hospitality and tourism will be among those sectors, certain sectors that may have to suffer lockdown restrictions for a more continued period of time will possibly continue to get the financial assistance as it currently stands. So they perhaps, and again I repeat, it's pure speculation, people in the likes of the tourism sector may continue to get the benefit of wage grants at the 80% cover level and not the 60% in order to assist them, because it is seen, obviously we've seen the plans for a return to what's called the new normal, a horrible term, but that's what everyone seems to be calling it, that the likes of pubs and hotels and other tourism businesses may be among the last to be allowed to fully reopen. So there's definitely some very strong calls being made to allow those kinds of businesses in the tourism sector to have, I suppose, more particular attention and to get the benefit of the current job retention scheme for as long as possible at the 80% level. So, of course, the risk of getting it wrong, HMRC has made it very clear that they will be carrying out audits, as they normally do anyway, but they'll be focusing in on trying to identify examples of job retention scheme fraud. They opened up a whistleblowing line only over about a week ago, just over a week ago, and already there have been over 800 complaints already logged in, and that's a figure taken from a few days ago, so I'm sure that figure has greatly increased now. So we know that, as with everything, the revenue is involved in the need to take retrospective action, and that can include, issuing penalties, interest on top of the penalties, and repayments of monies that they believe has been, fraudulently claimed by employers who perhaps had staff on furlough, but the staff were actually working. I've already come across a few media reports of that happening on a fairly significant level in some areas. So just be aware of that. It wouldn't be too difficult for the revenue, for example, to detect fraudulent claims where the employers haven't stuck to the rules of the scheme and have continued to let staff who are supposed to be on furlough continue to let them do some form of work. Obviously, that kind of thing will have a reputational impact and adverse impact on business reputation, and will probably attract media coverage for the next number of years, I would imagine. And also you have the risk where, so it's a slightly different angle, where employers do not select fairly in terms of placing people in furlough. Then you've got the risk of unfair dismissals and possibly also unlawful discrimination complaints as well. So just be aware of the potential for tribunal compensation in those scenarios as well. So coming to the end now, but just some major points in summary. It's important to follow good practice during the furlough process. Employment is still in place for furlough staff. They may not be working, but they're still accruing holiday leave. They're still entitled to be treated as an employee along with those who are working and receiving the benefits of being an employee in the context without getting perhaps full pay or actually doing any work. Good practice will obviously help employer to mitigate against any of the risks that we've talked about. Regular and open communication with staff is vital, and that includes staff who are on furlough and staff who aren't on furlough, of course, but particularly obviously for staff who are on furlough who maybe feel isolated, maybe feel that they're out of the picture. While it's important to retain a channel of communication with them and to keep them updated with things, encourage them to undertake training where possible, where it's financially feasible. That should be encouraged. And employers should now obviously start to make plans for when the job retention scheme ends in October. Will you need to use it until the end of October? What are you going to do when it does come to an end? Obviously, the situation could be dramatically different by the time the scheme ends. And obviously, it's important to take an assessment now of what you will do. Will you be bringing everyone back? Will you need to make some redundancies? Those are the sorts of questions that employers will need to consider now.